"That's not your driver." The janitor's urgent whisper cut through the marble lobby like a knife through silk. Marcus Chen, the 63-year-old maintenance supervisor who had cleaned these floors for 27 years, grabbed CEO Katherine Sterling's elbow just as she was about to step into the gleaming black Escalade. His weathered hand trembled against her $1,000 sleeve, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze in the vast atrium of Sterling Industries' Manhattan headquarters. The man behind the wheel wasn't James, her trusted driver of 8 years. This stranger's eyes held something cold, calculating, something that made Marcus's instincts scream danger after decades of watching people come and go through these revolving doors. Katherine's designer heels clicked to a stop on the polished floor, her breath catching as she truly looked at the driver for the first time that morning. The 45-year-old CEO of one of America's largest pharmaceutical companies stood frozen between the janitor's warning and her waiting car. Katherine Sterling had built her empire from nothing, rising from a small-town Kansas pharmacy to commanding boardrooms filled with billionaires. Her sharp blue eyes, usually focused on quarterly reports and merger acquisitions, now darted between Marcus and the imposter behind the wheel. The lobby's crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across her face, highlighting the sudden tension in her jaw. She had survived hostile takeovers, backstabbing board members, and corporate espionage attempts, but something about this moment felt different, more personal, more dangerous. Have you ever had that gut feeling that saved you from disaster? Share your story in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Your intuition might inspire someone else today. The morning sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed to dim as the gravity of Marcus's warning settled into her bones. Katherine's mind raced back to the morning briefing she'd ignored, too focused on the Beijing acquisition to pay attention to security updates. Her executive assistant, Patricia, had mentioned something about James calling in sick, but Katherine had barely registered it, assuming the agency would send a replacement as always. Now, standing in the lobby she'd walked through thousands of times, every detail seemed magnified. The fake driver's hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, his knuckles white with tension. His uniform was perfect, too perfect, lacking the slight wrinkles and coffee stains that marked James's authentic presence. The car itself, while identical to her usual ride, had plates she didn't recognize. How had this gotten past her security team? David Morrison, her head of security, was nowhere to be seen, and the usual morning guards seemed distracted, checking their phones instead of maintaining their posts. Marcus Chen had learned to read people during his decades of invisible service. While executives worried about stock prices and market shares, he noticed the small things, the way people carried themselves, the tension in their shoulders, the truth in their eyes. He'd seen this man arrive 30 minutes early, circling the building twice before parking in James's usual spot. The stranger had studied Katherine's photo on his phone, practicing her name under his breath. But it was the gun-shaped bulge under his jacket that had sent Marcus hurrying from his supply closet, abandoning his mop bucket in his haste to reach the lobby. His own story was one of quiet observation and unrecognized wisdom. Immigrating from Taiwan 40 years ago, he'd built a life of honest work, sending 3 children to college on a janitor's salary. To most people in this building, he was invisible, just another part of the marble and glass landscape. But Marcus saw everything, and what he saw now terrified him. The imposter's face transformed the moment he realized Katherine had stopped. His practiced smile faltered, replaced by something harder, more desperate. Through the tinted windows, Katherine could see him reaching for something beside the seat. The lobby, usually bustling with morning arrivals, seemed eerily quiet. Where was everyone? The reception desk sat empty, the security monitors unmanned. Even the ever-present hum of the building's ventilation system seemed muted, as if the entire structure was holding its breath. Katherine's hand instinctively moved to her phone, but she'd left it charging on her desk, planning to grab it after her quick ride to the airport. She was supposed to fly to Seattle this morning for the shareholder meeting, a trip only her inner circle knew about. The realization hit her like ice water. This wasn't random. Someone had planned this. Someone who knew her schedule, her habits, her vulnerabilities. Marcus's grip on her arm tightened as the fake driver opened his door. "Ms. Sterling, we need to move. Now." His voice carried an authority she'd never heard from him before, cutting through her CEO composure to reach something more primal. Katherine found herself backing away from the car, her body responding to his urgency, before her mind could process the full danger. The driver was out now, his hand disappearing inside his jacket. His movements were too smooth, too practiced, like someone trained for violence rather than driving. Catherine's Louboutin heels, symbols of her success, now felt like anchors as she tried to match Marcus's quickening pace toward the stairwell. The marble floor that usually announced her powerful presence now threatened to betray her with each hurried step. Behind them, she heard car doors slamming and voices shouting, but Marcus didn't let her turn around. 20 years of boardroom battles hadn't prepared Katherine for the raw fear flooding her system. She'd negotiated with senators, dined with presidents, and faced down activist investors. But this was different. This was physical, immediate, and terrifyingly real. As Marcus pulled her into the stairwell, she caught a glimpse of 3 more men entering the lobby, all wearing the same dark suits, all moving with the same predatory purpose. Her mind tried to process who would want her dead or kidnapped. The list was longer than she cared to admit. The recent FDA approval for their revolutionary cancer drug had made her company worth billions overnight, but it had also destroyed several competitors. Then there were the offshore accounts she'd discovered last month, evidence of embezzlement that reached into her own board of directors. She'd been planning to present her findings at today's shareholder meeting, a revelation that would send several powerful people to prison. The stairwell echoed with their footsteps and labored breathing. Marcus, despite his age, moved with surprising agility, guiding her up instead of down. "Basement's compromised," he explained between breaths. "Saw them there this morning pretending to be delivery men." Catherine's designer suit, tailored for boardrooms not escape routes, restricted her movements. She kicked off her heels, the cold concrete shocking against her feet. How did a janitor know more about the threat against her than her entire security team? The answer came with sickening clarity. Her security had been compromised. David Morrison, whom she'd trusted with her life for 5 years, had either been bought or replaced. The safe room on the 15th floor, known only to her executive team, was no longer safe. Marcus was taking her somewhere else, somewhere unplanned, somewhere these men wouldn't expect. Between the 2nd and 3rd floor, Katherine heard the stairwell door below crash open. Voices echoed up the concrete shaft, professional and coordinated. These weren't street thugs or desperate criminals. These were professionals, military trained from the sound of their movement patterns. Marcus suddenly veered left, pushing through a door marked maintenance staff only. The familiar corporate hallways gave way to a maze of service corridors she never knew existed. Pipes ran overhead, and the walls were unpainted concrete. This was Marcus's domain, the invisible arteries that kept her gleaming corporate temple functioning. He moved through the passages with absolute confidence, taking turns without hesitation. Katherine realized that in all her years as CEO, she'd never once wondered about these hidden spaces, these parallel worlds where people like Marcus spent their days keeping her empire running. The service corridors opened into a mechanical room filled with boilers and ventilation equipment. Marcus locked the door behind them and wedged a metal bar under the handle. For the first time since the lobby, they stopped moving. Catherine's chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, her perfect composure completely shattered. Sweat had ruined her professionally styled hair, and her stockings were torn from the concrete stairs. But she was alive, and that was more than she might have been if she'd gotten into that car. Marcus moved to a grimy telephone on the wall, an ancient rotary model that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Building's internal line," he explained, dialing a number from memory. "Can't be hacked or traced like your fancy smartphones." The irony wasn't lost on Katherine. All her cutting-edge security systems, her encrypted communications, her executive protection details, none of it had saved her. Instead, she owed her life to a janitor with a rotary phone. The conversation Marcus had was brief and in a language Katherine didn't recognize. When he hung up, his face was grim but determined. "My nephew works for the real police, not whoever those men downstairs bought. He's coming with units we can trust." Katherine sank onto an overturned bucket, the reality of her situation crashing over her. Someone had orchestrated this perfectly, timing it for when she'd be most vulnerable, when her usual protections were compromised. But they hadn't counted on Marcus Chen, the invisible man who saw everything. Through the mechanical room's narrow window, she could see police cars surrounding the building. But were they real police, or more imposters? The paranoia was suffocating. In her world of corporate warfare, She'd always known who her enemies were. Now every face was potentially hostile, every uniform potentially fake. Marcus stood guard by the door, his mop handle now a weapon in his weathered hands. The determination in his stance reminded Katherine why she'd started her company in the first place, to help people like him afford the medications that could save their lives. Somewhere along the way, between the IPO and the international expansion, she'd lost sight of those people. She'd become insulated in her executive bubble, protected by layers of staff and security that had ultimately failed her. But Marcus hadn't failed her. This man who cleaned her toilets and emptied her trash had risked everything to save her life. The humility of it was overwhelming. She thought about his family, the children he'd mentioned sending to college, the life he'd built through honest work. If something happened to him because of her, she'd never forgive herself. Time crawled in the mechanical room. Every sound made them tense. Every footstep in the corridor outside sent adrenaline surging. Katherine's mind kept circling back to the betrayal. Someone in her inner circle had orchestrated this. The fake driver had known exactly when to arrive, exactly where to park, exactly how to blend in. The security cameras had been conveniently offline. The guards had been distracted or replaced. Even the reception staff had vanished at precisely the right moment. This wasn't just an assassination attempt. It was a complete infiltration of her corporate structure. The Beijing acquisition she'd been so focused on suddenly seemed trivial. What good was expanding into Asian markets if she couldn't trust the people in her own building? Through the dirty window, Katherine watched as more vehicles arrived. Some looked official, others didn't, and she could no longer tell the difference. Marcus's nephew had promised to signal when it was safe, but what if he'd been compromised too? The paranoia was eating at her, making her question every relationship, every alliance. Her phone, sitting on her desk 15 floors up, would be exploding with messages by now. Patricia would be wondering why she hadn't left for the airport. The board members in Seattle would be preparing for a meeting she might never attend. Her ex-husband in California would remain blissfully unaware that the mother of his children had nearly vanished into a black SUV. The life she'd built, the empire she'd created, all of it balanced on the edge of a knife she hadn't even seen coming. A sharp knock on the door made them both freeze. 3 short, 2 long, 1 short. The pattern Marcus had been waiting for. He cautiously approached, speaking in that same foreign language through the door. When he finally opened it, a young police officer stood there, his resemblance to Marcus unmistakable. Behind him, Katherine could see real SWAT officers, their movements professional but lacking the predatory edge of the imposters. "Aunt Katherine," the young man said with a slight smile, using the honorific as if she were family. "Uncle Marcus called. We've secured the building, but we need to get you somewhere safe while we sort this out." The relief was overwhelming, but Katherine knew this was far from over. Whoever had orchestrated this attempt was still out there, still hidden within her organization. The real work of survival was just beginning. As they prepared to leave the mechanical room, Katherine turned to Marcus. The words she wanted to say seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what he'd done. This man, who'd been invisible to her for years, had seen what her entire security apparatus had missed. He'd risked his life for someone who'd never even asked his last name until today. The shame of that realization mixed with profound gratitude. "Marcus," she said, her voice hoarse from fear and exertion, "I don't know how to thank you." He smiled then, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "You already did, Miss Sterling. That medicine your company makes, it saved my wife's life 3 years ago. Sometimes we protect what protects us." The simplicity of his loyalty, the purity of his motivation, stood in stark contrast to the complex web of betrayal she'd have to unravel. As they emerged from the mechanical room, surrounded by real police officers, Katherine Sterling realized that her life would never be the same. The invisible had become visible, the powerful had become vulnerable, and the hunter had discovered she was prey. The safe house wasn't what Katherine expected. Instead of a high-tech bunker, Marcus's nephew had brought them to a modest apartment above a Vietnamese restaurant in Queens. The smell of pho drifted through the floorboards, mixing with the musty scent of old carpet. Katherine sat on a worn couch, still in her ruined designer suit, trying to process how her morning had descended into this nightmare. Detective Timothy Chen, Marcus's nephew, was coordinating with federal agents on multiple phones, his rapid-fire conversations revealing the scope of the conspiracy. 3 board members were missing. Her CFO's phone was going straight to voicemail. The attempted kidnapping was just the visible part of something much larger. Katherine's hands trembled as she accepted a cup of tea from Marcus's wife, Lily, a small woman whose gentle presence belied the strength it must have taken to battle the cancer Katherine's drug had cured. The normalcy of the moment, sitting in a stranger's living room drinking jasmine tea, felt surreal against the backdrop of her collapsing world. 25 years ago, Katherine had been a different person entirely. Katherine Marie Johnson from Haven, Kansas, population 1247, where everyone knew everyone and dreams were expected to stay small. Her father had run the only pharmacy in town, a modest operation that served 3 counties. She'd grown up measuring pills, learning the names of every medication, understanding that behind every prescription was a person in pain. The summer before college, she'd watched her father turn away the Hendersons because they couldn't afford insulin for their diabetic son. That night, she'd found him crying in the stockroom, surrounded by medicines that could save lives but remained locked behind price tags. "Healthcare shouldn't be a luxury, Katie," he'd told her, his voice broken. "But I can't save everyone and keep the lights on." That moment had planted a seed that would grow into Sterling Pharmaceuticals, built on the promise that innovative drugs would be accessible, affordable, life-changing. But promises, she'd learned, were easier to make than to keep. The path from small-town pharmacy to pharmaceutical empire had been paved with compromises. Harvard Medical School had opened doors, but walking through them meant leaving Haven behind. Her marriage to Richard Sterling, heir to a medical device fortune, had provided the capital for her first research lab. She'd kept his name after the divorce, a corporate shield that opened doors his money had first unlocked. The early years were pure, focused on developing a revolutionary delivery system that could make expensive drugs more effective at lower doses. She'd assembled a team of brilliant researchers who shared her vision. Dr. Sarah Kim, who'd lost her mother to a treatable disease in rural Korea. Dr. James Wright, whose childhood in Detroit's poorest neighborhoods drove his passion for accessible healthcare. Dr. Mohammed Hassan, whose refugee camp experiences had shown him how simple medications could mean the difference between life and death. Together, they'd created something extraordinary. But success had attracted different kinds of people, those who saw dollar signs where she saw healing. The first betrayal had come from Richard, her ex-husband, who'd tried to steal her patents during the divorce. She'd fought him off, but it had taught her to trust carefully, to build walls. The second had been her original business partner, who'd sold trade secrets to competitors. Each betrayal had hardened her, transformed her from the idealistic young woman into someone who could navigate corporate warfare. She'd learned to be ruthless when necessary, to fire entire departments, to crush competitors who threatened her mission. But somewhere in those battles, the mission itself had begun to change. The girl who'd wanted to save everyone had become a woman who spoke in profit margins and market shares. The affordable drugs had become premium products. The accessible healthcare had become exclusive treatments for those who could pay. She'd told herself it was temporary, that once the company was stable, she'd return to her original vision. But stability had become growth, and growth had become an endless hunger that consumed everything it touched. Marcus's voice interrupted her spiraling thoughts. He was on the phone with someone, speaking in Taiwanese, but she caught enough to understand he was arranging something. When he hung up, his expression was grave. "My contacts at the port say 3 shipping containers left your warehouse this morning. Manifests forged. Whatever they took, it's already heading overseas." Katherine's blood ran cold. The warehouse contained prototypes for their next generation of drugs, including the pediatric cancer treatment they'd been developing for 5 years. If those formulas reached the wrong hands, children would die while bootleg versions flooded the market. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. This wasn't just about killing or kidnapping her. It was about stealing her company's future. Someone had been planning this for months, maybe years, positioning pieces on a chessboard she hadn't even known existed. The apartment's windows were covered with heavy curtains, but Katherine could hear the city beyond them. New York had been her battlefield for 2 decades, its gleaming towers the fortresses she'd conquered. Now she was hiding above a restaurant in Queens, dependent on the kindness of people she'd never bothered to know. Lily Chen moved around the small kitchen with quiet efficiency, preparing food as if feeding people in crisis was natural to her. The apartment was filled with photographs: Marcus and Lily's wedding, their children's graduations, grandchildren's birthdays. A life built on family, community, connection. everything Katherine had sacrificed for success. Her own daughter, Jessica, was at Stanford, pursuing a degree in social justice that included plenty of courses on corporate malfeasance. Their relationship had become a series of scheduled calls and wire transfers. Her son, Michael, worked for a non-profit in Haiti, as far from her world as he could get. When had her children become strangers? When had success become so lonely? Detective Chen returned from his calls with troubling news. "We've arrested 7 people so far, including 2 from your security team. But this goes deeper than corporate espionage. We're finding connections to international crime syndicates, possibly state actors." He showed her surveillance footage on his laptop. There was David Morrison, her trusted security chief, meeting with unknown men in a warehouse. There was her CFO, Patricia Nguyen, accessing files she had no authority to see. The betrayals multiplied before her eyes, each trusted face becoming a threat. But it was the last image that shattered her. Dr. Sarah Kim, one of her original researchers, her friend for 20 years photographing classified documents. Sarah, who'd cried with her when they'd received their first FDA approval. Sarah, who'd stood as maid of honor at her wedding. Sarah, whose mother's death had driven her passion for affordable medicine. If Sarah could betray her, then trust itself was an illusion. The Pro restaurant below was getting busy, the lunch rush filling the air with voices and clinking dishes. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that floors above them, a billion-dollar empire was crumbling. Katherine thought about her morning routine, the one that had nearly killed her. Every day for 15 years, gym at 5 a.m., office by 6:30, first meeting at 7. She'd prided herself on that discipline, that predictability. But predictability, she now understood, was vulnerability. Everyone knew where she'd be, when she'd be there, how she'd react. She'd become a creature of habit in a world that rewarded unpredictability. The fake driver had known she always sat behind the passenger seat, that she always checked emails during the ride, that she never looked up until they reached their destination. Her power had made her complacent, her routines had made her a target, and her trust had made her blind. Lily Chen sat beside her, offering a bowl of soup that smelled like comfort and home. "You need to eat," she said gently. "My mother used to say, 'Empty stomach, empty strength.'" The simple wisdom hit harder than any boardroom rhetoric. When had Katherine last eaten a meal she actually tasted? When had food become just fuel for the next meeting? She took the bowl gratefully, the first spoonful warming her in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. Lily studied her with knowing eyes. "Marcus told me about you years ago. Said you were different from the others, that you cared. But caring can get lost in climbing, yes?" The accuracy of the observation was painful. Katherine had climbed so high she'd lost sight of the ground, of the people like Lily and Marcus, who kept the world turning while she played games in the clouds. Her secure phone, provided by Detective Chen, buzzed with messages from the few people she could still trust. Her head of research and development, Dr. James Wright, had barricaded himself in the lab, protecting the formulas that hadn't been stolen. Her general counsel, Rebecca Martinez, was working with federal agents to freeze accounts and prevent more theft. But for every ally, there seemed to be 2 enemies. The board was assembling for an emergency meeting, and Katherine could imagine the sharks circling. Without her physical presence, they'd vote her out, install someone more manageable. Everything she'd built over 25 years could be dismantled in 25 minutes. The irony was bitter. She'd survived the kidnapping attempt only to face a corporate execution. At least the physical threat had been honest in its intentions. Marcus returned from a conversation with his nephew, his face thoughtful. "They found something interesting in your would-be driver's phone. Messages in Russian, mentions of the formula and a deadline of tonight. Whatever they're planning, it's not over." Katherine's mind raced through the possibilities. The formula could mean many things, but her gut told her it was Project Haven, named after her hometown. It was her redemption project, a malaria vaccine that could be produced for pennies and distributed freely in developing nations. No patents, no profits, just pure medical intervention that could save millions. She'd kept it secret from the board, funding it through discretionary accounts. If someone had discovered it, they'd either want to steal it for profit or destroy it to prevent the humanitarian gesture that would complicate Sterling Pharmaceuticals' ruthless reputation. Either way, children would die for the sake of someone's greed. The afternoon sun slanted through gaps in the curtains, casting bars of light across the worn carpet. Katherine felt like a caged animal, trapped between the physical danger outside and the corporate massacre happening in her absence. Every instinct screamed at her to act, to return to her tower and fight. But Detective Chen insisted they wait, gather intelligence, let the conspirators reveal themselves. Patience had never been her strength. She'd built her empire on decisive action, bold moves, calculated risks. Sitting in this modest apartment, dependent on others for her safety, went against every fiber of her being. But Marcus's steady presence reminded her that sometimes wisdom came from unexpected sources. He'd spent decades watching, learning, understanding patterns she'd been too busy to notice. Maybe it was time to stop talking and start listening. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a stranger. The polished CEO was gone, replaced by a middle-aged woman with smeared makeup and torn clothes. But there was something else in her eyes, something she hadn't seen in years. Vulnerability, yes, but also clarity. The near-death experience had stripped away the corporate armor, revealing the person underneath. She thought about her father, dead 10 years now, and wondered what he'd think of what she'd become. Would he be proud of the empire, or horrified by its cost? Would he recognize his daughter in the woman who'd forgotten the names of her employees' children while memorizing profit projections? The Haven Pharmacy still existed, run by the Henderson's son, the same boy whose insulin her father couldn't afford to give away. Life had a cruel sense of circular irony. Detective Chen's team had set up a command center in the restaurant's back room, technology spreading across tables, meant for family dinners. Katherine watched them work, noting how seamlessly they cooperated, how naturally they trusted each other. No one was checking for hidden agendas or corporate ladder opportunities. They had a job to do, and they did it together. It was how her company had started, before success had attracted the parasites. She wondered if it was possible to return to that simplicity, that shared purpose. Or was she too changed, too hardened by decades of corporate warfare? The question haunted her as she watched Marcus bring his nephew coffee, the simple gesture of family caring for family. When had she last done something kind, without calculating its return on investment? As evening approached, patterns began emerging from the investigation. The conspiracy centered around 3 board members who'd been secretly building a competing company using Sterling's research. They'd needed her gone to complete the takeover, making it look like she'd been kidnapped by criminals, while they heroically stepped in to save the company. Dr. Sarah Kim had been blackmailed, her daughter threatened if she didn't cooperate. David Morrison had been bought with promises of CEO position in the new company. Patricia Nguyen's husband had gambling debts that made her vulnerable. Each betrayal had a human story behind it, a reminder that even enemies had reasons. Katherine felt the anger drain away, replaced by something harder to define. Disappointment? Sadness? Or maybe just exhaustion from playing a game where winning meant becoming someone she no longer recognized. The question that haunted her most was simple. How had she not seen this coming? She'd prided herself on reading people, on understanding motivations and anticipating moves. But she'd been looking in the wrong direction, focused on external threats, while the real danger grew within. Her obsession with expansion had blinded her to contraction. Her focus on profits had obscured the human costs. Her trust in systems had replaced faith in people. And now, sitting in a small apartment above a Fio restaurant, saved by a janitor she'd ignored for years, Katherine Sterling faced the hardest truth of all. The empire she'd built had become a prison, and the only way out might be to let it burn. But first, she had to save Project Haven, the one pure thing left in her corporate legacy. The children it could save deserved better than to be collateral damage in a billionaire's war. The knock on the apartment door at 3 a.m. wasn't gentle. 3 heavy pounds that made everyone freeze. Detective Chen drew his weapon, while Marcus moved protectively toward his wife. But the voice that came through the door was unexpected, cultured with a slight British accent. "Katherine, it's Charles Whitmore. I know you're in there and we need to talk." Katherine's stomach clenched. Charles Whitmore, her longest-serving board member, the man who'd mentored her through her first hostile takeover. Either he was part of the conspiracy, or he was her only hope. Detective Chen looked to her for guidance, and in that moment Katherine made a choice that went against every security protocol. "Let him in," she said quietly. "But search him first." The old Katherine would have never taken such a risk, but the old Katherine had already died in that lobby, and whoever was being reborn in this queen's apartment had different instincts. Charles Whitmore entered, looking like he'd aged a decade in one day. His usually impeccable suit was wrinkled, his silver hair disheveled, and his hands trembled slightly as Detective Chen patted him down. At 73, he'd been a titan of industry when Katherine was still in medical school. He'd served on her board for 15 years, guiding her through the labyrinth of corporate politics with wisdom and occasional ruthlessness. Now he sat on the same worn couch where Katherine had spent the day questioning everything, his aristocratic bearing at odds with the humble surroundings. "They came to me this morning," he began without preamble. "Offered me your position, 30 million in offshore accounts and a guarantee my grandchildren would get into any university they wanted." He paused, meeting her eyes. "I told them to go to hell, but I played along enough to learn their plans. You deserve to know what's coming." The conspiracy, Charles explained, was more elaborate than even Detective Chen's investigation had uncovered. 3 board members, Harrison Blake, Vivian Cross, and Robert Tang, had partnered with a Chinese pharmaceutical giant to orchestrate a complete takeover. They'd been planning for 2 years, placing operatives throughout Sterling Pharmaceuticals, turning employees with blackmail or bribes. The kidnapping was meant to be blamed on Russian criminals, providing cover for her disappearance while they seized control. But the real prize wasn't the company's current profits, it was the future. "They know about Project Haven," Charles said gravely. "They plan to steal the formula, mass-produce it with substandard ingredients, and sell it at premium prices to governments desperate to combat malaria. Millions of children will get fake vaccines while they pocket billions." The revelation hit Katherine like a physical blow. Her redemption project, her attempt to honor her father's memory, would become a weapon against the very people it was meant to save. Charles wasn't finished. He pulled out a tablet, showing financial documents that made Katherine's head spin. "They've been shorting Sterling stock through shell companies, planning to crash the value before buying it back at pennies on the dollar. Your disappearance was supposed to trigger a panic sell-off tomorrow morning." But then his expression shifted, becoming something harder to read. "I've spent the day liquidating my own assets, Katherine. Everything I have, about 800 million, is ready to prop up the stock when markets open. But I want something in return." Here it was, Katherine thought, the catch. Everyone had a price, even mentors. She waited, studying the man who'd taught her that business was war and kindness was weakness. "I want you to remember why you started this company. I want the old Katherine back, the one who cared more about healing than stock prices. Because I'm dying, Katherine, pancreatic cancer, stage 4. I have maybe 6 months, and I'll be damned if I let my legacy be enabling another soulless corporation." The room fell silent, except for the hum of computers in the corner. Charles Whitmore, the man who'd crushed unions and destroyed competitors, was asking for redemption. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Lily Chen quietly poured him tea, the simple gesture of compassion cutting through the tension. Charles accepted it with hands that shook more from emotion than age. "I have a granddaughter with type 1 diabetes," he continued. "Every month I watch my son struggle to afford her insulin, even with my help. The same insulin that costs $8 to produce but sells for $300. I helped build this system, Katherine. I taught you to be ruthless, to prioritize shareholders over patients. I was wrong." His confession hung in the air like a challenge. Could either of them change at this point? Could an empire built on profit be transformed into something more humane? Katherine found herself really looking at Charles for the first time in years. Behind the corporate titan was a grandfather facing mortality, a man realizing too late that his legacy was measured in harm as much as success. She thought about her own children, how they'd chosen paths as far from her world as possible. Would she be making similar confessions in her 70s, begging for forgiveness from those she'd trained to be cruel? "Tell me everything," she said finally. "Every detail of their plan, every weakness we can exploit." But even as she slipped into strategic mode, something had shifted. This wasn't just about saving her company anymore. It was about saving Project Haven, protecting the innocent, and maybe, just maybe, finding a way back to the idealistic young woman who'd wanted to heal the world. Charles had brought more than information. He'd brought proof. Videos of the conspirators' meeting recorded by his personal security team. Documents showing the Chinese company's history of producing counterfeit medications that had killed thousands. Bank records tracing bribes to Katherine's employees. It was a treasure trove of evidence, but also a roadmap of her own failures. Every corrupted employee represented someone she'd failed to inspire, to value, to protect from temptation. Harrison Blake is the weakest link, Charles explained, showing a photo of the nervous-looking board member. He's in debt to casino owners who don't accept bankruptcy as payment. He didn't want this, but they gave him no choice. If we can flip him, get him to testify, the others fall like dominoes. Katherine studied Blake's photo, remembering when she'd recruited him 5 years ago. He'd been brilliant, but hungry, eager to prove himself. She'd used that hunger, pushed him to deliver results without asking about the cost. Now that hunger had been turned against her. Detective Chen had been coordinating with federal agents throughout Charles's revelations. The evidence was enough to arrest the conspirators, but timing was critical. Move too soon, and others in the network would scatter. Wait too long, and Project Haven would be in China, being corrupted into a tool for profit. Katherine felt the familiar thrill of strategic planning, but it was tempered now by Marcus's steady presence, Lily's quiet strength, and Charles's late-blooming conscience. She wasn't alone anymore, wasn't the isolated CEO making decisions in her ivory tower. "We need to be smarter than them," she said, her voice carrying new authority. "They expect me to hide or to come charging back. Instead, we're going to use their arrogance against them." The plan that formed was risky but elegant. Let the conspirators think they'd won, let them expose themselves fully, then strike with precision rather than force. By dawn, the apartment had transformed into an unlikely war room. Charles's personal security team, men and women he'd trusted for decades, worked alongside Detective Chen's officers. Marcus and Lily kept everyone fed and alert, their hospitality extending even to this strange battle. Katherine found herself delegating differently than before, asking for input rather than issuing orders, building consensus rather than demanding compliance. It felt foreign but right, like using muscles that had atrophied from disuse. She watched Charles work his phone, calling in favors from a lifetime in business, and realized he was teaching her one last lesson. Power wasn't just about what you could take, but what you could give. Every person in this room was here by choice, united by purpose rather than payment. The first phase of their plan involved Dr. James Wright, still barricaded in the Sterling Pharmaceuticals lab. Katherine spoke to him via encrypted phone, hearing the exhaustion in his voice. "They've cut off my access cards, but I've got the Project Haven files secured. Katherine, this formula could save so many lives. We can't let them corrupt it." James had been with her since the beginning, one of the few who'd maintained his integrity through the company's transformation. She'd kept him insulated from the corporate politics, letting him focus on the science that drove him. Now his isolation had saved him from corruption but left him vulnerable. "James, I need you to do something that goes against every protocol we've established. I need you to leak false information about Project Haven, make them think the formula is incomplete, without a component stored off-site." The pause on the line was long before he answered. "You're setting a trap, using our life's work as bait." "Yes," she admitted, "but it's the only way to save it." While James prepared the false intelligence, Katherine worked with Charles to manipulate the stock market opening. They would let the price fall initially, allowing the conspirators to think their plan was working. Then, strategic buying from Charles's funds and Katherine's remaining allies would stabilize it, creating confusion. In that confusion, Harrison Blake would receive an offer, full immunity and protection in exchange for his testimony. Detective Chen's team had already located Blake's family, moving them to safety before the casino owners could use them as leverage. It was chess at the highest level, but with human pieces and real consequences. Katherine found herself thinking like her father for the first time in decades, seeing the people behind the positions, the families affected by every move. Marcus interrupted her planning with simple wisdom. "In my country, we have a saying, 'The bamboo that bends survives the storm while the oak breaks.' You've been an oak for too long, Miss Sterling." His words carried the weight of experience, of someone who'd survived by adapting, by finding strength in flexibility. Katherine realized she'd built her company like a fortress, rigid and imposing. But fortresses could be besieged, walls could be breached. Perhaps it was time to learn from bamboo, to find power in bending rather than breaking. She looked around the room at her unlikely alliance, a dying billionaire seeking redemption, a janitor whose wisdom exceeded his station, police officers who still believed in justice, and employees who'd remained loyal despite everything. This wasn't the army she'd have chosen, but it might be the one she needed. The morning news broke with carefully orchestrated chaos. Reports of Katherine Sterling's disappearance competed with rumors of financial irregularities at Sterling Pharmaceuticals. The stock price plummeted as expected, and Katherine watched the conspirators reveal themselves on the financial networks, barely concealing their glee. Vivian Cross appeared on CNBC expressing grave concerns about leadership stability. Robert Tang gave interviews about the need for new direction in the company. They were positioning themselves as saviors while orchestrating the destruction. But Harrison Blake was notably absent, already in federal custody, spilling every detail of the conspiracy in exchange for protection. His testimony was being recorded, evidence that would damn the others completely. Katherine felt no satisfaction watching his breakdown, only sadness for how greed and fear could corrupt even brilliant minds. By noon, the trap was fully set. The conspirators had taken the bait about Project Haven's missing component, dispatching teams to search Katherine's private properties. What they found instead were federal agents arresting everyone involved. The Chinese pharmaceutical executives, thinking they were meeting Blake for the final transfer, walked into a room full of prosecutors. Vivian Cross was arrested on live television, her composed facade cracking as handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Robert Tang tried to flee to his private jet, only to find it surrounded by police. The empire they'd tried to steal crumbled in hours, brought down not by corporate warfare, but by simple justice. Katherine watched it all from the apartment above the Picho restaurant, feeling strangely detached from the drama. These people had tried to kill her, to steal her life's work, to corrupt medicine meant for children. Yet all she felt was tired, deeply and profoundly tired of the game itself. Charles Whitmore sat beside her as the news coverage continued. His intervention had saved her company, but his eyes held a question she wasn't ready to answer. What came next? Sterling Pharmaceuticals would survive, the stock already recovering as news of the arrests spread. Project Haven was safe, ready to be manufactured and distributed as originally intended. But could Katherine herself go back to the executive suite, to the daily battles and compromises? Could she pretend the last 24 hours hadn't changed everything? "You know what the hardest part is?" Charles asked quietly. "It's not the dying. There's realizing how much time I wasted being someone I didn't even like." His words hit home with painful accuracy. Katherine thought about all the hours spent in boardrooms instead of with her children, all the relationships sacrificed for quarterly earnings, all the good intentions corrupted by the pursuit of more. As evening fell, Detective Chen announced it was safe for Katherine to leave the apartment. The immediate threat was over, the conspirators in custody, the company secured. But Katherine found herself reluctant to go. This small space above a restaurant had shown her something she'd lost. Community, simplicity, the power of ordinary kindness. Marcus and Lily had risked everything to protect her, asking nothing in return except that she remember her humanity. Their apartment, filled with photographs and memories, held more wealth than her penthouse ever could. "Stay for dinner," Lily insisted. "You've had a long journey and it's not over yet." Katherine accepted, knowing Lily meant more than just the physical journey from her tower to this humble space. The real journey was internal, from the woman she'd become back to the person she'd meant to be. The boardroom at Sterling Pharmaceuticals had never felt more like a courtroom. Katherine entered through the main doors for the first time in 2 days, flanked not by her usual security detail, but by Marcus Chen and Detective Timothy Chen. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The remaining board members sat frozen, their faces masks of uncertainty as they processed her survival. Some had genuinely believed she was dead. Others had suspected but stayed silent, complicity through cowardice. At the head of the table sat CFO Patricia Nguyen, her hands cuffed, federal agents standing behind her. The woman who'd managed Sterling's billions now managed only her tears, the weight of her betrayal etched in every line of her face. Katherine took her seat slowly, deliberately, letting the silence build. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a new quality, authority without arrogance, strength without cruelty. "Let's discuss the future of Sterling Pharmaceuticals. And more importantly, let's discuss why some of you won't be part of it." The federal prosecutor, a young woman named Angela Rodriguez who reminded Katherine of herself 20 years ago, laid out the evidence with surgical precision. Financial records, encrypted communications, video surveillance, The conspiracy's scope made several board members gasp. Those who'd remained neutral, thinking themselves safe on the sidelines, realized their inaction had been captured too. Katherine watched their faces change as they understood that surviving wasn't the same as escaping judgment. Dr. Sarah Kim was brought in next, her brilliant mind now shackled by consequences. She couldn't meet Katherine's eyes as she testified, describing how they'd threatened her daughter, how she'd tried to feed them false information while protecting what she could. "I thought I was strong enough to play both sides," Sarah whispered. "I thought I could protect everyone. I was wrong." Katherine felt the anger she'd expected to feel, but also something else. Recognition. How many times had she compromised, thinking she could control the outcome? Charles Whitmore commanded the room's attention as only a dying man with nothing to lose could. His testimony was devastating, not just about the conspiracy, but about the culture that had enabled it. "We created this," he said, looking directly at Katherine. "Every time we prioritized profits over people, every time we crushed competition instead of fostering innovation, every time we treated employees as expendable resources rather than human beings, we invited this betrayal." His words hung in the air like an indictment of everything Sterling Pharmaceuticals had become. Board members who'd served for decades shifted uncomfortably, seeing their legacies reframed as cautionary tales. Katherine found herself nodding, accepting the harsh truth. The conspiracy hadn't corrupted her company. It had simply revealed the corruption already there. When Harrison Blake took the stand, his testimony provided the technical details that sealed multiple fates. The casino owners who'd pressured him, the Chinese executives who'd orchestrated the theft, the network of employees who'd sold their integrity for promises of wealth, all were exposed. But it was his description of the planning meetings that chilled the room. "They laughed about it," Blake said, his voice hollow. "Laughed about how the malaria vaccine would be diluted, how desperate governments would buy it anyway, how children dying would be written off as acceptable losses for profit margins." Several board members looked physically ill. Katherine thought of Project Haven, still safe in James Wright's lab, and felt a surge of protective fury. Whatever else came from this disaster, that vaccine would fulfill its original purpose. No child would die for someone's stock options. The confrontation Katherine had dreaded came when Patricia Nguyen finally spoke. Her CFO of 8 years, the woman who'd been her right hand in building Sterling's financial empire, looked broken beyond repair. "You want to know why I did it?" Patricia's voice cracked. "My husband lost everything gambling. They were going to kill him, kill our children. But that's not the whole truth." She finally met Katherine's eyes. "I did it because I stopped believing in what we were doing. Every quarter we'd celebrate record profits while raising drug prices. Every board meeting we'd discuss market strategies while people rationed insulin. I told myself the conspiracy couldn't be worse than what we were already doing legally." The accusation hit harder than any physical attack could have. Katherine saw herself through Patricia's eyes, a leader who'd lost her way, dragging others into moral bankruptcy with her. Marcus Chen's testimony provided an unexpected turning point. The janitor who'd saved her life now sat in the witness chair, dignified despite his work clothes. He spoke about watching the company change over his 27 years of service, about the early days when Katherine knew every employee's name, when the mission statement about accessible healthcare wasn't just corporate decoration. "I clean the executive floor every night," he said simply. "I see the champagne bottles after you celebrate price increases. I empty the trash full of resumes from researchers who quit because their conscience couldn't take it anymore. I hear the jokes about capturing market share while my community can't afford basic medications." His quiet words carried more weight than any prosecutor's argument. He wasn't angry, wasn't accusatory. He was simply truthful, and that truth revealed the rot at Sterling's core. The board members who'd remained neutral faced their own reckoning. Katherine addressed them directly, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "You thought staying silent kept you clean. You thought not participating in the conspiracy absolved you. But every time you voted for a price increase without questioning it, every time you ignored the human cost of our decisions, you were complicit in creating the culture that made this betrayal inevitable." She saw several members flinch, recognizing themselves in her words. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, who'd served on the board for 15 years, actually stood up. "You're right," she said quietly. "I told myself I was being practical, realistic, but I was being cowardly. I resign, effective immediately." Her resignation sparked others. Within minutes, half the board had stepped down, leaving empty chairs that seemed to echo with possibility. Detective Chen presented the final evidence, documents showing how the conspiracy had planned to frame Katherine's disappearance on Marcus himself. They'd intended to paint him as a disturbed employee seeking revenge, planting evidence in his locker, using his immigrant status to fuel xenophobic narratives. The plan's cruelty was breathtaking. The man who'd saved her life would have been destroyed to cover their crimes. Katherine looked at Marcus, seeing him fully for perhaps the first time. His calm acceptance of what might have happened, his lack of bitterness despite the intended injustice, humbled her completely. "They knew I'd be the perfect scapegoat," Marcus said simply. "Who would believe a janitor over executives? But they didn't count on one thing, that I'd see Ms. Sterling as a person worth saving, not a symbol worth destroying." As the legal proceedings continued, Katherine found herself making decisions that the old version of herself would have considered insane. She authorized full cooperation with authorities, even knowing it would reveal questionable practices throughout Sterling Pharmaceuticals. She opened the books completely, exposing not just criminal activity, but the legal yet unethical systems they'd all participated in. Stock prices plummeted again, but she felt lighter with each revelation. Charles Whitmore, watching from his seat, nodded approvingly. "Sometimes you have to burn the diseased wood to save the tree," he murmured. The metaphor resonated. Sterling Pharmaceuticals was diseased, had been for years. The conspiracy was just the visible symptom of a deeper sickness. The human cost of the conspiracy became clear as more employees testified. A young researcher who'd been pressured to falsify test results to meet deadlines. A marketing manager forced to create campaigns targeting vulnerable populations. A sales representative who'd quit rather than push unnecessary medications on elderly patients. Each story added another layer to the indictment, not just of the conspirators, but of the system itself. Katherine listened to each testimony, forcing herself to confront the harm her leadership had enabled. She'd built an empire, yes, but at what cost? The numbers she'd celebrated in quarterly reports had names, faces, families. The efficiency she'd demanded had crushed spirits, compromised ethics, destroyed lives. When court recessed for lunch, Katherine found herself in the executive bathroom she'd used thousands of times. Her reflection looked different now. Older, certainly, but also clearer somehow. The makeup was gone, the power suit replaced by simple clothes Lily Chen had lent her. She looked less like a CEO and more like a person, and the transformation felt profound. Behind her, the door opened. Dr. James Wright entered, his face showing the strain of protecting Project Haven. "They're all asking what happens next," he said quietly. "The researchers who stayed loyal, the employees who refused bribes, the ones who still believe in what we started. What do I tell them?" Katherine turned from the mirror, seeing in James the idealist she'd once been. "Tell them the truth," she said. "Tell them everything changes now." The afternoon session brought unexpected support. Employees Katherine had never met testified on her behalf, describing small acts of kindness she'd forgotten, policies she'd implemented that had helped their families, moments when she'd chosen compassion over profit. A mailroom clerk whose cancer treatment had been covered by the company's insurance, a security guard whose daughter had received a Sterling scholarship, a cafeteria worker whose suggestion about waste reduction had been implemented company-wide. These weren't the power players or the executives. They were the invisible people who kept Sterling running. Their testimony painted a complex picture, a leader who'd lost her way but hadn't lost her humanity entirely. Katherine wept openly hearing their stories, understanding finally that leadership wasn't about commanding from above, but serving from within. The prosecution's closing arguments were damning but fair. Angela Rodriguez painted a picture of corporate culture gone wrong, of how the pursuit of profit had corrupted medicine's noble purpose. But she also acknowledged Katherine's cooperation, her willingness to expose the truth regardless of personal cost. Ms. Sterling was nearly a victim of this conspiracy, Rodriguez concluded, but she was also, in many ways, its architect, not through criminal intent, but through creating an environment where such criminality seemed logical, even inevitable. The question now is whether she can transform that environment, or whether Sterling Pharmaceuticals needs new leadership entirely. It was the question Katherine had been asking herself. Could she lead the transformation, or was she too much a part of the problem to be the solution? As evidence concluded, one final revelation emerged. The Chinese pharmaceutical company hadn't just wanted Sterling's formulas, they'd wanted to destroy Project Haven specifically. The free malaria vaccine threatened their own profitable treatments, would have disrupted an entire market built on suffering. Katherine realized the conspiracy had been fighting her one genuine attempt at redemption, trying to corrupt the single pure thing left in her corporate legacy. The irony was sharp. Her enemies had seen the threat in her humanity more clearly than she'd seen it herself. They'd recognized that Project Haven represented a different path, one where medicine served healing rather than wealth. Their determination to destroy it proved its power. The judge called a recess before final deliberations, and Katherine found herself back in the boardroom with the few members who remained. The empty chairs seemed to judge them all, monuments to cowardice and corruption. But in the remaining faces she saw something she hadn't expected: possibility. These were the ones who'd stayed through the worst, who'd faced the truth without running. Dr. James Wright, steady and principled; Rebecca Martinez, the general counsel who'd helped expose the conspiracy; a handful of others who'd chosen integrity over safety. "So," Katherine said, her voice steady, "who wants to help build something better?" The question hung in the air, heavy with promise and responsibility. One by one, hands rose. Not many, but enough. Enough to start over, to rebuild on a foundation of truth rather than greed. The old Sterling Pharmaceuticals was dying in this room, but something new was being born. The legacy of that morning in the lobby lived in every decision Sterling Pharmaceuticals made. Marcus Chen's courage had saved more than Katherine's life. It had saved the soul of a company and perhaps sparked change in an entire industry. His philosophy, that everyone deserved to be seen, heard and valued, became corporate policy backed by action. The janitor, who'd been invisible now, had his story taught in ethics classes. His family's photographs, once confined to a small apartment, now appeared in Sterling's annual reports as examples of the families they served. Katherine Sterling's transformation from ruthless CEO to healing advocate inspired countless others. She received letters from executives who'd begun questioning their own practices, from employees who'd found courage to speak truth to power, from patients whose lives had been saved by affordable medicines. Each letter reminded her that change, however difficult, rippled outward in ways impossible to predict. Her children, once estranged, now worked beside her, building a legacy of integrity rather than wealth. The morning Katherine returned to that marble lobby 5 years later, everything had changed, yet nothing had. The building still gleamed, success still mattered, but the definition of both had transformed. Success meant the child in Somalia receiving Project Haven vaccines. It meant the diabetic in Detroit affording insulin. It meant the janitor promoted to management because wisdom mattered more than degrees. Marcus stood beside her, his weathered hands now signing documents that would save lives, his insight now shaping policies that affected millions. "You know what I've learned?" "Ooh." Katherine asked Marcus as they watched employees stream through those same revolving doors that had nearly been her last sight. "Power isn't about what you can take. It's about what you can give, what you can change, who you can lift up. You taught me that." Marcus smiled, his eyes crinkling with the wisdom that had saved them both. "No, Ms. Katherine, you always knew it. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us who we really are." The pharmaceutical industry would never be the same. Sterling's example had proven that profit and purpose could coexist, that healing and wealth weren't mutually exclusive, that seeing people as humans rather than consumers was not just ethical but sustainable. Other companies followed suit, not from altruism, but from recognition that Sterling's model worked. The invisible had become visible across boardrooms and break rooms, voices once silenced now shaping decisions that affected millions. As the sun set over Manhattan, Katherine Sterling stood in her simple office looking at a photograph on her desk. It showed her father in his small-town pharmacy, surrounded by customers he'd served for decades. Below it sat another photo, the entire Sterling Pharmaceuticals family at their annual picnic, Marcus and Lily Chen at the center, surrounded by thousands of employees, patients, and families. Two images decades apart, but telling the same story. Healthcare was about caring, business was about people, success was about service. If this story touched your heart, If it reminded you that change is possible even in the darkest moments, share it with someone who needs hope today. Sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with the simplest acts of courage, like a janitor warning a CEO, like choosing humanity over profit, like remembering why we're really here. Thank you for witnessing this journey.